So in the first two modules in this unit, we focused on the law of demand in Module 5 and the law of supply in Module 6. And now in Module 7, we will put them together to determine how market price and quantity are determined in a market economy. And that is by looking at equilibrium, the market equilibrium for price and the market equilibrium for quantity. So, in this module, the first thing I will do is to explain to you how supply and demand curves determine a market's equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Then I will describe how price moves the market back to equilibrium in the case of either a shortage in the market or a surplus in the market. I will explain how equilibrium price and quantity are affected when there is a change in either supply or demand, and then explain how equilibrium price and quantity are affected when there is a simultaneous change in both supply and demand. So, when we use the term equilibrium in the market, in a competitive market, this is the point where the quantity demanded of a good is exactly equal to the quantity supplied of that good at a particular price. The price at which this takes place is called the equilibrium price, or also known as the market clearing price. And the reason it's called the market clearing price is because every buyer finds a seller for their good, and every seller finds a buyer. And there are no buyers left over looking for someone to sell them the good, and there are no sellers left over looking for someone to buy the good. So the quantity of the good bought and sold at that price is the equilibrium quantity. One way to think about equilibrium is like a stopped pendulum. Once a pendulum has started, it should continue to swing back and forth, never stopping. If you stop it, it will never restart the swinging. That's equilibrium in the market. There are no changes in price, quantity demanded, or quantity supplied. Think market stability. So how do we find the equilibrium price and quantity? Well, it's time to bring back the demand half of a table that summarizes cotton demand and supply at 7 possible prices. Now, the equilibrium or market clearing price is the only price where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. At this price, there is no tendency for the price to either rise or fall. In other words, the market is in a state of balance. Now, when we look at the price per cotton here, and we look at the demand and supply graphs in this slide, we can see that the point where the quantity demanded is exactly equal to the quantity supplied is the only point where the two curves intersect. And if we draw a horizontal line over to the y-axis, we see that the market equilibrium price is $1 per pound for cotton, and the quantity of cotton that will be bought and sold at that price is 10 billion pounds. So 10 billion pounds is the equilibrium quantity, and the price in the market will be $1, the equilibrium price, and that will be the market clearing price. But what happens if the price is set above the equilibrium price? What if instead of charging $1 per pound for cotton, suppliers charged $1.50 per pound for cotton? Well, that is a price that is above market equilibrium. So, what would happen? Well, think of what happens to the price of many items like sweaters or Christmas trees right after Christmas. Most of you will agree that there are widespread after Christmas sales on everything from clothes to electronics to Christmas decorations and even cars. Why is this? Well, that's because the store has too many items that went unsold prior to Christmas. In other words, they have a surplus of sweaters or too many sweaters. And the best way to get rid of a surplus of sweaters is to lower the price. So, a surplus exists when the quantity supplied at a particular price is greater than the quantity demanded at that price. And the surplus is equal to the quantity supplied minus the quantity demanded. In this case, that would be the price of $1.50. But as the price comes down, you'll notice we move down the demand curve and we move down the supply curve. And the further down in price we go, the closer and closer the gap between the two curves gets until the price falls to $1 and we are back at market equilibrium. So while a market may be out of equilibrium on a temporary basis, in the long run, any temporary surplus will be just that, temporary, and the market will fall back to equilibrium on its own. Now, what about the opposite? What happens if the price is set below equilibrium? In this case, what if we set the price of cotton at 75 cents a pound? That's a price below the equilibrium price. Well, imagine an auction where there is only one thing up for sale, like a valuable painting, and many people who wish to buy it. What happens? The auctioneer begins to raise the price and the number of bidders begins to fall. Eventually, all but one bidder has been eliminated because the price got so high that all others dropped out. When you have a shortage of something, the best way to eliminate the shortage is to increase the price. And as you increase the price, you move up the supply curve and up the demand curve. The gap between the two gets smaller, and eventually you get back to market equilibrium at a price of $1. So a shortage exists when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied at a particular price. And the shortage is equal to the quantity demanded minus the quantity supplied. In this case, the difference between 11.5 billion pounds of cotton demanded and 9.1 billion pounds of cotton supplied. So the shortage here would be equal to 2.4 billion pounds of cotton. On your Launchpad activities, you'll be taking a look at an FYI activity entitled The Price of Admission. And there you'll see that the competitive market model often determines the price you pay for concert tickets. So now, let's look at equilibrium and shifts of the demand curve. The discussion of market equilibrium might imply that once equilibrium has been reached, that the story is over. But the world, and by extension the markets for goods and services, is constantly changing. Much of those market changes can be explained with simple supply and demand analysis. Now, have you noticed anything getting more or less expensive? Many of you will be thinking of gasoline prices. So what would make the price of gasoline more expensive? Think about this. Well, it would probably be something that could be a demand curve shifter. And when a demand curve shifts, you will find it easy to locate the new intersection and label it as the new equilibrium price and quantity. But it's important to know how the market adjusts from original to new equilibrium points. There are three important components that you must be able to identify for the AP exam. Number one, you must be able to identify which demand or supply curve shifter is at work in the market. Secondly, you have to be able to determine what curve is shifting, supply or demand, and in which direction. Is it moving to the right or to the left? And third, you must be able to identify what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity as a result of the shift. So let's take an example. Tickets to a concert for a popular musician or band. As a band has more success and gets more popular with fans, what happens to the price of a concert ticket? Well, if we assume that this slide represents the market for concert tickets to this band, although it's shown as the price of cotton, but let's assume that it's concert tickets for a band, the original price would be labeled as P1 and the quantity would be QE. Now, let's look at the three important components for this scenario. One, there were stronger tastes and preferences. Because of that, the demand curve shifts to the right. And we have a new equilibrium point. Price and quantity both increase. But why is that? Well, notice the rightward shift of the demand curve. At the original price of P1, there is now a shortage of tickets. When there is a shortage, the price must rise to get rid of the shortage. The equilibrium quantity will move upward along the stationary supply curve to the intersection of supply and the new demand curve. So an increase in demand leads to a movement along the supply curve due to a higher equilibrium price and higher equilibrium quantity. So notice, there was a shift of the demand curve which led to movement along the supply curve. And as a result, the price of concert tickets, or shown here, the price of cotton, goes up, and the quantity of cotton or concert tickets sold in the market rises as well. Now, let's look at another example. During a recession, people buy fewer new cars and trucks. What happens to the price of a new car or truck in a recession? Well, let's assume that the graph we're looking at here is the market for autos. The original price is labeled as P, and the original quantity is Q on the original demand and supply curve. But now, incomes go lower during a recession. As a result, the demand curve shifts to the left for normal goods. And we have a new demand curve labeled D1. Price and quantity both decrease. The new price of autos is lower than the original price. The price goes down to P1, but the quantity of autos sold in the market also decreases from Q to Q1. So a shift of the demand curve led to movement down the supply curve and led to a lower quantity supplied and a lower quantity demanded. This is a leftward shift of the demand curve. At the original price of P, there is now a surplus of automobiles. When there is a surplus, the price must fall. The equilibrium quantity moves downward along the stationary supply curve to the intersection of supply and the new demand curve that has shifted. Okay, so now what happens when the supply curve shifts? Now, notice that when we say that supply has increased, it has increased horizontally. More supply equals more quantity. It does not increase vertically along the y-axis. It increases horizontally along the x-axis. So the example here we'll look at is the example of cotton again. Cotton is an important raw material in the making of clothes, like denim jeans. If the global price of cotton rises, what happens to the price of jeans? Well, in the market for jeans, the original price would be P, and the quantity would be Q. Now let's look at the three important components for this scenario. So number one, an input price has increased. What is the input? Cotton, because cotton is used to make jeans. The supply of jeans, the curve would then shift to the left. And that would then lead to a decrease in the supply of jeans. The price, in this case of jeans, would decrease, and the quantity would decrease. But why? Well, at the original price of P, there is now a shortage of jeans. When there is a shortage, the price must rise. The equilibrium quantity moves upward along the stationary demand curve to the intersection of demand and the new supply curve. So a decrease or shift of the supply curve leads to a movement along the demand curve to a higher equilibrium price and lower equilibrium quantity. Now let's look at this example. Let's assume production technology has greatly improved in agriculture, producing more corn on the same amount of land. How has the better technology affected the price of corn? Well, if we assume that this is the market for corn, the original price of corn is labeled P and the original equilibrium quantity is labeled Q. Now let's analyze the three important components for this scenario. Number one, what is the shifter? The shifter is better technology, or a change in technology. Which curve does this shift? It shifts the supply curve, not the demand curve. Which direction does that curve shift? It shifts to a right, because it will lead to an increase in the supply of corn. Once we do that, we can see that the price has fallen to P1, so the price decreases, and the quantity increases to Q1. But why? Well, this is a rightward shift of the supply curve. At the original price of P, there is now a surplus of corn. When there is a surplus, the price must fall. The equilibrium quantity then moves downward along the stationary demand curve to the intersection of demand and the new supply curve. So here's a summary of what we can and cannot predict when there is both a demand and a supply shift. Demand and supply move in opposite directions. When demand increases and supply decreases, the equilibrium price rises, but the change in the equilibrium quantity is ambiguous. It could rise or fall. When demand decreases and supply increases, the equilibrium price falls, but the change in the equilibrium quantity is ambiguous. We're uncertain. Why is that? Well, because we have two opposing forces at work here. Suppose the price of cheeseburgers is rising. In addition, the price of pepperoni is rising. How will these two events affect the market for pizza? Well, first, the demand curve will shift because the price of a substitute good is rising, in this case, cheeseburgers. This shifts the demand for pizza to the right, and thus the price and quantity of pizza both increase. But when it comes to supply, the price of an input, in this case pepperoni, is rising, and the supply of pizza shifts to the left. Price increases and quantity decreases. Both of these shifts generate an increase in the price, so we can with certainty predict a higher price of pizza. However, the change in quantity depends on which of the two shifts is greater, the shift in demand or the shift in supply. And that must be explicitly stated and not assumed. Now, many of you will assume that there will be no change in the equilibrium quantity. Realize that this is just one of three possible outcomes for quantity. When the effect of the shift is not explicitly stated in the scenario, you must understand that either price or quantity will be ambiguous. To see this, plot changes to supply and demand individually to determine which is indeterminate. Either price or quantity will be the same for both shifts, and one will be opposite. The one that is opposite will be the ambiguous one. So, here's another example of demand and supply moving in the same direction. When both demand and supply increase, the equilibrium quantity increases, but the change in equilibrium price is ambiguous. When both demand and supply decrease, the equilibrium quantity decreases, but the change in equilibrium price is ambiguous. The Winter Olympics that were held a few years ago increased at that time the popularity of snowboarding, and more companies began to produce snowboards. So how would these events affect the market for snowboards? Well, supply would shift. More suppliers would be producing snowboards, so the supply of snowboards would shift, well, to the right. Actually, I have it drawn differently here, so let's skip this slide. This shows a large decrease in supply accompanied by a small increase in demand. And you can see when that happens that we know that the price goes up, but in this case the quantity went down. Here's an FYI on making bacon that you will do in your launch pad. But from it you will see that a decrease in the supply of bacon may cause consumers to squeal, but it won't cause a lasting shortage because higher bacon prices will decrease the quantity demanded and increase the quantity supplied. So, to summarize, here is a table to consider if you have simultaneous shifts of supply and demand. Okay? Now again, in some of these cases, you might assume that there would be no change in the equilibrium price or equilibrium quantity. But when the effect of the shift is not explicitly stated in the scenario, you have to understand that either price or quantity will be ambiguous. And you determine the one that will be the same for both shifts and the one that will be opposite. The one that is opposite will be the one that is ambiguous. So here's a chart to help you organize your thinking on that. Okay? If supply increases but the demand increases at the same time, price cannot be determined, but we know the quantity demanded and supplied will go up. If supply increases but demand decreases, we know that the price will go down, but the quantity can't be determined. If supply decreases and demand increases, we know the price will go up, but the quantity will be ambiguous. And if supply decreases and demand decreases, the quantity will go down, but the price will be ambiguous. So now we come to the end of Module 7, and this is what we've learned in Module 7. One is that the equilibrium price, or market clearing price, is the price at which the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. Second, when the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded, this is known as the equilibrium quantity. When the price is above its market clearing level, there is a surplus that eventually pushes the price down, and the surplus will be temporary and eventually return to equilibrium. And fourth, when the price is below its market clearing level, that will lead to a shortage of the good that will be only temporary and eventually push the price back up to equilibrium. This concludes our look at Module 7 on equilibrium.